and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on frontier technology and policy solutions to manage aquatic ecosystem in collaboration with the European Geosciences Union, Global Policy Insights, and EnviPol. We thank you all for joining us in this really interesting discussion, and we hope that you're all doing safe and well in these times. Can I please request the audience to just keep themselves mute? Thank you so much. Now, I think those were some really heavy words that I spoke and that I said in the sentence when I was revealing the topic of this panel, and then frontier technology, policy solutions, and perhaps even aquatic ecosystem. But I think the idea behind this is to really break it down in easy words for you so that we can understand the crisis, the challenges that the aquatic world is currently in, and perhaps even bring about a concrete understanding of it, thereby discuss some solutions and understanding what the way forward is for it. Now, it's a known fact that the aquatic environments are affected by multiple anthropogenic stressors like overfishing, climate change, pollution, coastal erosion, habitat loss, and I think whatnot. I think this continued degradation of the aquatic ecosystems have suggested that innovative approaches are needed to support the initiatives and to protect the aquatic ecosystems and move closer in fulfilling the goals which have been laid down in the Sustainable Development Goals. The use of frontier technology in the form of artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, it offers a range of opportunities that have helped and proven to be of a significant impact on the environment. It is of utmost need, I think, to also examine how the policy measures can expand their potential benefits. After all, when policy and technology are put together, it can yield some really concrete impact in the best way possible. With the aquatic biodiversity being put to a great risk in today's time, considering the pre- and the post-pandemic situation, it is of utmost importance for us as young policymakers to really discuss what more can be improved on and talk about new models and new ideas in protecting the marine life. I think we have with us the best of the panelists and speakers who will be lending us their thoughts and ideas in the form of policy solutions in managing the aquatic ecosystems. They are experts in their own specific field of work, and they boast of some wonderful knowledge and experience in studying and understanding such issues. They are our current and past GPODS fellows, and I'm sure if you're curious to know what the GPODS fellowship is all about, I'll be posting this in the chat box in a while, and we would request you to please check out our website and follow us, check out our social media pages and follow us everywhere, because we are out there in the social media world so that we can stay connected. It would be great if the panelists could just wave your hand. If you can just wave your hand and cheer us with a big smile as I call out your name and introduce you all, right? So first and foremost, we have Swasti Raizada. She holds a degree in engineering and public policy, and she's currently serving as a senior consultant at Deloitte, right? So the next person that we have is Krishnapriya Vagla, who's fondly known as KP, and she has previously worked as a senior associate at Vedanta Limited and is a brilliant energy and environment lawyer. Next, we have with us Neha Naikware, who's currently working as a program manager at the Climate Collective, which is a nonprofit focused on unleashing innovation and entrepreneurial talents to solve environmental challenges. And last but not the least, we do have Yunusa Saheed, who's a WASH consultant. And I'm sure that he's also going to lend us with some really interesting ideas. Yeah. Of course, we also have Prabin, who will be co-moderating this session with me. And I think I'll be now coming to each one of you and maybe ask you for your own specific thoughts and reflections on this topic that we have chosen for this panel discussion. and maybe just get to know from you in your own words as to how you perceive the whole. I think let's just go on to Swasti maybe.
Thank you, Shrishti, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Uh, so I'll probably kick off with some bits on what Shrishti already spoke about in terms of defining what frontier technologies are, how we are seeing their deployment at local levels, and we're seeing these very interesting case studies emerge as a global community. And as we go forward into what is now being coined as the fourth industrial revolution. I don't like the term personally, but I think we probably as a global community need to think about some of these uh, things in terms of what are the policy challenges and how can we, as a community sort of get our heads around them, and if at all can we anticipate some of these challenges as they may arise once we start deploying some of these frontier technologies. So I don't want to talk a lot about all the possible policy challenges, because I think there's going to be a ton going forward, but I want to sort of structure my argument around 4 key points. uh, the first thing that we are seeing, and I think KP in her part will speak extensively about this, is that we are seeing a lot of these, niche studies being done by oceanographers, by climatologists, by and we're seeing a lot of like deployment of technologies like use of sonar, lidars, even like what is called remotely operated vehicles, which is basically essentially you attach a HD camera and there's a device that you sink into the oceans that helps you collect a lot of data in terms of the topography of the seabed. It helps you also take images that then helps you do a lot of 3D mapping of the ocean floor and the ecology within these aquatic systems. And then there are like a lot of eco sounders, for example, that are used. But we are seeing like these very niche studies across the globe happening today that are sort of informing policy thinking around the world. But even today, we sort of like still in a fix in terms of how to think about these technologies in a very global paradigm. So there is a lot of local action and a lot of like community action around that, but essentially those studies are sort of throwing up a very broader overarching theme, which is that going forward, all our preservation, conservation, and management efforts of aquatic ecology will require more of systems thinking. And when I say systems thinking, you can consider this as essentially an approach where we as humans sort of attach a mental model to the way we look at policy problems, and these mental models are then essentially driven by a function of what's the information that is pouring in and what is our thinking behind processing that information. So essentially what is happening through these high-end frontier technology is that the science is now gradually evolving, and we are seeing this across issues like climate change, even 3D printing, for example, has multiple applications in manufacturing, supply chain, and all of that. But essentially, like the science is becoming more and more advanced, and it's evolving, and it's throwing a ton of data back. So the question then becomes that as if you envisage your mental model as a function of your information and your thinking, the information is becoming more and more refined, but that also essentially requires a new age thinking to how we then develop these new age mental models, which is essentially being able to think more circular. Historically, our thinking has been more linear when we look at these problems. I mean, like uh, we used to think about how to address the challenge of plastic, and one of the initial debates was let's just ban it, right, which is linear thinking. But we are looking at these impacts of microplastic, nanoplastics, and how like they've been accumulating in the ocean over the years. And maybe we will require a more nuanced discussion around some of these solutions that we will need for policy solutioning of these challenges. So I think what I want you all to probably take back is that there is a growing need to look at these problems in a more systems thinking approach. And once we do that, I think as a global community, we will also see these new age roles emerging for our traditional experts in this space. I mean, like earlier we used to rely on a lot of scientists, but the whole umbrella of scientists is now evolving into oceanographers, climatologists. And then how can we, as policymakers, enable all of them to come together on a single platform and then inform this knowledge sharing? And how can young policymakers like all of us here, or young parliamentarians or young leaders, ambassadors to our nation states, be then informed and adequately have that understanding of how to challenge that big data, because essentially that's also going to be a new age skill that will be required for policy solutioning. The second point that I want to talk about today is there's going to be there's this entire deployment of top down technology is also going to require a lot of uh, uh, you know getting our heads around uncertainty. And if you probably are aware of the entire debate of climate change is something that is in a sense pushed by our thought leaders in terms of what is the probability of this event happening, right? So we have our targets around 2050, we have a target around the end of the decade, but the urgency then arises with the concept of how uncertain it's going to be or how certain it's going to be. And that's essentially like a very critical aspect of how science drives policy solutions. So one thing that probably you should I think take back is how can policymakers then work with the scientific community in terms of quantifying some of those uncertainties. So today, for example, if we are sort of developing these studies around what our coral reef health is today in the ocean and what is going to be 30 years down the line, that timeline will have a certain degree of uncertainty in terms of predictions. So then how do we sort of get our heads around as policymakers in terms of which intervention will require urgent action and which of it can be deferred? And that's going to be critically driven by what is that degree of uncertainty in the solution that we are providing. And the third point that sort of is a segue into my previous point is that essentially these solutions will therefore require a short term, mid term, and a long term approach. There are certain studies that are now providing that sort of scientific signaling to policymakers, and the current knowledge is sufficient to take action today. But then there are going to be some studies that still need more evolution in terms of just the advancement of technology, and maybe we are not there yet. So for example, like there are a lot of studies today being done by NOAA. There's a whole study, and probably you can read about it, the NOAA ship Nancy Foster, which is essentially a ship that you know throughout the year they do extensive studies in terms of collecting data from the seabed in the Caribbean, and that's sort of throwing up very interesting insights in terms of how to manage our coral reefs. And maybe then it sort of feeds into our policy that maybe we will need to increase or think again about the regulations around marine biodiversity hotspots. So we might have to increase the hotspots if we want to achieve that X percentage of conservation, right? So essentially, like, those are studies which are highly evolved now, and probably we need to take action today. But then there are some studies and some areas like, use of space technology to solve some of these problems here on Earth that require a bit more investment from the global community before we can probably sort of get our heads around what that intervention should be. And the last and most important point that I personally believe in, I think, is essentially the question of who owns the data underlying our global commons when it comes to deploying frontier technologies, and especially at the scale of aquatic, maintaining the health of our aquatic ecosystems, because what we are seeing is that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by our aquatic ecosystems, and then this collection of data is going to be massive going forward. So who owns this data? Because these resources are global commons. And do we then say that this data should also become a global common? Because today we don't have that sort of a global governance framework. We are seeing work in pockets in terms of like and these initiatives are primarily being driven by big tech companies like Amazon, Google today, so will that materialize into commercialization of that data? Or and there's a huge risk involved in that, because then essentially the players who've historically been involved in exploiting some of those resources can continue to do that using the same data if we do not act today. So I think one of the key questions is, how do we then define a global governance framework around the use of that data that is being collected using some of these technologies? And most importantly, will that lead to a technological divide between developed nations versus developing nations? Because most of these investments, most of these studies are today either funded or based, geographically based, in developed nations. So it becomes a very critical aspect in terms of how can that technology be transferred to developing countries, and how can there be an equity in terms of how nations can leverage some of these frontier technologies for protection of our aquatic ecosystems. So I'll pause there because I know I've spoken a lot and I'll probably let others take over. But I think I just wanted to touch upon these 4 points so that they become essential, critical, food for thought when you go back from this event today.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Swasti, for really opening up the entire discussion for us. And I think those reflections that you had in regards to the topic that we are going to talk on, I think they were just wonderful. And I'm sure that we have so much more to hear from you again. So I think we'll be coming back to you. And I think it's time for me to now really pass on the virtual mic to my co-moderator, Prabin, so that he can then take over and ask the others, the other panelists to speak on particular issues. So over to you, Prabin.
Thank you. And I think Swasti has made quite clear that the call for action in regards to implementing frontier technology is more than ever now. And I think as policymakers, the first thing we need to establish are the key challenges which exist in this field. So I would like for Saeed and Neha to take over and introduce what are the major challenges which are currently faced in the aquatic ecology, which can possibly be countered by frontier technology. So I would give the mic to Saeed.
Thank you very much, Prabin. As we all know, the world is actually in crisis. I mean, water crisis. There are a lot of insufficient water around. And according to Copen, who happen to be a very renowned scholar, water scholar in South Africa, he at one point said, water scarcity is an issue of water appetite in South Africa, where the white people or the rich guys have access to water and the poor people do not have access to water. And this has to do with the growing impact of climate change, with insufficient water around the world. What is happening in South Africa is happening in other countries of the world. But what is important is, how is the water body being managed? What are the policy instruments? What are the technology that actually been put into the management of water resources? I could tell you, like a case in Uganda, there was a policy to protect the wetland, but up to today, as I'm telling you, wetland has given way to roads, wetland has given way to buildings, and it's not properly managed. These are ecosystems that help us to naturally purify our water. You don't need a gigantic wastewater management plant when you have wetlands available for your water to get purified. You don't need so much of a POD system, which is a very good technology that was actually implemented in the Netherlands to be able to cover or to protect your city from flooding. Wetland does that in a natural system. But while this natural ecosystem are growing out of hands or out of security in most of the countries, simply because it's giving ways to roads, it's giving ways to buildings. There's a need for new technology to be able to monitor the ecosystem itself. And that's exactly why I'm very much in support of establishing what is called Citizen Observatory. It's currently in existence, but it needs to be updated. We're all used to technology like Anfo now, and information is quite accessible. Why don't we have a app that is going to enable citizens in every community to be able to monitor their water bodies and be able to report it to the government so the government can easily take actions, even if they're going to be politics. But the policy of allowing people to be the watchdog of their own water bodies, I think it will go a long way to be able to help people to monitor what is actually how they have been impacted by the water situation. And also across country, there's what we call virtual water transfer. I could tell you some countries don't rear cattle, but they buy it from other countries in order to be able to secure the water sector. If we do have people that have this citizen observatory where all this transactions are going on. Some of these transactions are actually not plain. People don't know about it because in some countries, they don't go flowers. They import flowers and they're importing the water system and it has a cheaper rate. So some of these countries are becoming more drier than expected, while other countries are securing their water system. I think during this while, we need to ensure that technology, citizen science, most especially, where people capacity is actually being built to be able to report the water situation in their country. I think that's a very good, in my own opinion, it's a very good approach and perspective, and that will also strengthen the existing policy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think Neha could take over and introduce what are the other challenges which currently exist and which we would aim to tackle in this panel.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, Said, for touching upon most of the inland challenges. Then I think I'll focus more on the estuaries and their importance, and also from the biodiversity perspective. So for those of you who don't know, estuaries are basically the transitional areas between land and sea. You could call it freshwater and saltwater environments. Now, these estuaries support abundance of life, and they are very diverse habitat types. These could include oyster reefs, coral reefs, rocky shores, submerged aquatic vegetation, marshes, and mangroves. Uh, like in the whole climate debate, a lot of these habitats have been gaining importance. Now, why is that? That's because a lot of birds, mammals, fishes, and other wildlife depend on these habitats to live, to feed, to reproduce. They provide support to migratory species and to the species who rely on sheltered water for their reproduction and so on. So basically, these estuaries are like the nurseries of the sea. That's their biodiversity importance. Now, a lot of organisms at some point in their life depend on these estuaries. This makes them pivotal in terms of the overall balance of the marine ecosystem. When I say marine, it includes the whole 70% of our planet. Now, these ecosystems also are have a lot of indigenous importance, and that that leaves a lot of scope for scientific research in here. Um, Now, speaking from the climate change perspective, if they have a lot of importance as carbon capture or sequestration. We usually think that the forests are the heroes who would, taking a lot of carbon dioxide, but the studies show that estuary sediments can, store up to 10 times, store the carbon up to 10 times faster than the sediments in the forests. And if they are left undisturbed, they can store this carbon below ground for thousands of years. Now, that's how important these ecosystems are, and this can make a huge difference in the whole, climate fight. But then why are we not protecting them? That's the maybe a good question of the top. Because these estuaries have huge cultural, social, and economic value. Like historically, a lot of major cities on the coastal areas that you see have been based on these estuaries, and there has been massive extraction of resources for the whole civilization development that has taken place around these estuaries. Now, if we were to put a number on this, the coastal watersheds have provided 70 million jobs, and about they have contributed about 8 to 10 trillion dollars in GDP over the first decade of 21st centuries to the coastal. In terms of the coastal countries, we could also consider that as global. Now, I think I'm speaking, like my time is about to be up, so I'll just go ahead and, mention some of the problems that are impacting these estuaries. That would be embarking, creating shipping ports, oil spills, excessive harvesting, invasion by introduced species. That means whenever the ships come on the port, they bring in invade species which invade the original ecosystem and disturb the delicate balance over there. Reclaiming land by drainage, America has in fact, converted a lot of these estuaries into agricultural lands by filling them, then extracting sand, salts, dumping of plastic, sewage, industrial waste, and lately aquaculture or monoculture is becoming very famous in terms of harvesting important uh, commercial species on the coastal areas to feed our population. So these are basically the problems. Now, where does frontier technology come in? If we were to name a few, be it AI, autonomous manure technology, or edge computing, microchips, green tech, all of this can be put to use in many ways in each of these estuaries. Now, they are all unique. One solution cannot fit all. But if we work with the local communities to come up with, the local solutions to tackle the problems in a particular ecosystem, we could get there eventually, maybe. So yeah, that's my remark. I think KP will touch more on the importance of the local communities, so I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha, for that. And I think the challenges which currently face us in the water ecology and how frontier technology can be implemented in that have been very well covered by both you and Saeed. So thank you for that. But I think in terms of policy making, we need to understand that it is not a new idea that frontier technology needs to be established for aquatic ecology. But there have been certain issues with implementation, and I think the best way to understand that would be to go back to previous cases which there have been attempts to introduce frontier technology. And I think KP could take over in that and give us some better information on how these policies have enacted out in the past and how these policies could enact out in regards to frontier technology and aquatic ecology. So KP, I think you could take over.
Right. Thank you so much, Praveen. And so I'm going to draw a lot from what Swasti had mentioned earlier and from Neha and Sahid's points. So my focus essentially is on the role of community engagement and the role of local indigenous communities and indigenous and traditional knowledge in aiding in their them aiding in the successful deployment of your frontier technologies, because more often than not the way the mainstream view generally is that technology solutions are a panacea and that they will solve the problems. But like Neha has also mentioned, each and every ecosystem is unique in terms of how people derive value from it and what kind of species exist in that particular ecosystem. So our solutions and our policies have to take that into account. So we cannot have a one size fit all solution like Neha had mentioned. So there have been many, it's already very well established that community engagement and community participation and participative decision making lead to successful policies, right? because you are considering the inputs of the people that are getting affected by your policy. You are taking their lived experiences into account when you're making a policy, and that becomes very central, especially when it comes to managing ecosystems, because a lot of livelihoods depend on it. And so, for example, if you take drawing in from estuaries that Neha was mentioning, so let's talk about the Sundarban Delta, right? So it's a very unique ecosystem, and it's been recognized under the Ramsar Convention now. But around 4 million people, both in the northern side and the southern side of the delta, depend on the Sundarban ecosystem for their livelihood. And the Sundarban ecosystem is also home to many threatened and critically endangered species, right? So when you talk about deploying technology solutions, like for example, I was as part of this panel discussion, I was reading up a lot on it, and there are quite a lot of interesting tech solutions, right? So there is a robot that eats invasive species in Australia that is being used in the Great Barrier Reef, right? So for example, but when you talk about transplanting that technology in say the Sundarbans, you can't just do that. You have to take into consideration the role and the impact that it would have on the local communities. And again, Sahid had also mentioned, citizen observatories, right? Which is again, the thrust is on your local communities and how they can aid in the protection and in the management of a particular ecosystem. So drawing from that, there has been, a study in, in Africa, or the Lake Victoria wetlands, wherein the local villages were consulted, and because there's a lot of waste discharge that happens, and it's not treated properly, and it has like a circular and it creates a vicious cycle where it impacts not only the ecosystem itself, but also the health of the people that are dependent on it, right? So then your technology and your solutions have to take all of that into consideration. And we also have to understand that we do not live in a world where everybody is equally informed, right? And especially if we look at aquatic ecosystems and those that live around it, they are more often than not marginalized communities. And they are tribal communities that have always historically been excluded from your mainstream development activity. So there is a clear digital divide there, right? So when you talk about deploying things like, Internet of Things to, facilitate the flow of information, you have to think about capacity building. You have to think about training the local communities. You have to think about working together with the local communities. So and there have been many instances. Again, I'm just going to talk about a parallel here. For example, with respect to treating and controlling avian flu outbreaks in Southeast Asia. So the Food and Agriculture Organization sort of collaborates with the local communities and trains them to, recognize the symptoms and to alert the local authorities when, they think that there will be an outbreak. So the local authorities can then take the necessary action to mitigate the damage, right? So here what's happening is you're not only using your technology, you're using your information flow, and you're giving them a cell phone to take pictures, but you're also teaching them. You're teaching them to recognize problems, right? Which is very important. And another thing that was very interesting to me, because we talk about AI like it's the be all and end all, right? It's like it's the answer. But then we also have to consider that, now there is a lot of talk about AI bias, right? So then when you talk about managing very unique ecosystems that you cannot find anywhere else, and that are very critical to the overall health of our entire aquatic ecosystems, because like your fresh water then flows into your marine life, right? Like for example, the health of an estuary then impacts the health of the marine ecosystem. The health of your coral reef impacts the health of the high seas, and vice versa, right? So then the only way to sort of tackle that would be to incorporate the inputs and the traditional and indigenous knowledge into, I'm not a technical person at all, I'm a lawyer. So I might, be making a little conjectures here and there, so forgive me. But the way I see it, the only way to address this bias then is to incorporate the lived experiences and the inputs of, the local and the indigenous communities, right? Because there is no other way that a policy can work. Because if you're coming in and you're introducing something completely alien, that will not only the local community not support that particular intervention, but they will also, the policy will also not succeed, right? And as the future generation, our job is to ensure that we make successful policies and that we, you know, that we balance the needs of the livelihoods of the people that are dependent on a particular aquatic ecosystem and the health of that ecosystem, because they are very interrelated, right? They're very interconnected. And that is also something at a broader policy level that needs to be understood as well. And I think Swasti will talk more about that, but I'm just gonna again, give a little anecdotes here and there. So if we talk about the Whaling Convention, right? The Whaling Convention only talks about protecting the whales, right? And prohibits hunting of whales. But then there are so many marine species that are dependent on one another. And there is no overarching, policy framework at the international level. And it is very difficult to achieve that as well, because consensus building at an international level is an extremely, extremely difficult process. So that's my 2 cents, and I might have a couple of more cents to add later. But for now, yeah, I think we can go on to the next very talented person in the panel. Yes.
Thank you for that. And I think quite an interesting point which does stem out from that, which you talked about, is that a lot of indigenous communities are the ones which need to take the, which are the ones which are most connected to these tech ecologies. So for them, there also needs to be a form of incentivization structure which needs to be present, because a lot of them, due to their disconnect from the rest of the world, as you talked about, they do not understand, or they're not aware of how exactly can the ecology and how can long-term impacts on the ecology be detrimental to their society. So they need to be incentivized in a way that they need to be held accountable. They need to be more aware of the fact that what are the long-term impacts of this aquatic ecology, and why they need to implement frontier technology. Because if they do not have a incentive, or if they do not find a need to implement it, even if you do provide them with technology, they will not go on and work towards it, because of the fact that they're not aware, or they're not finding the incentives to follow it. So for a state or for any government, in order to add frontier technology to their aquatic ecology, they need to ensure that people who are involved in the daily interactions with this ecology itself, they understand that there is a need and there is a requirement for this frontier technology to be used, because otherwise there will be no incentives and there would be no reason for them to implement it. And even with providing the technology, it might not provide the results which policymakers look for. And speaking of policymakers, I think where Shrishti could come in now is that she could talk about what are the policy challenges which lay ahead of us, and what could be possible solutions, which policymakers should gear towards, and how could policymakers successfully introduce frontier technology and make it effective for saving the aquatic ecology of the future.
Prabin,
I think
did
he
you
meant Swasti.
Okay.
I think he definitely meant Swasti.
I'm so sorry about that.
Never mind. Swasti, I think you're on board now, and we are very keen to hear all your policy insights now. Yeah.
Thank you, Prabin. And that's a really good and difficult question to answer. I think I touched upon some of these global challenges in terms of how, as policymakers, we definitely need to get our head around how, and I think I will come back to that same point, because I think I'm very cautious about these overarching concepts of AI for social good, and uh, uh, ethical AI, because I think while these are very important initiatives in themselves, we need to be very cautious about what that technology is actually being used for on ground. So, and when I say this, and this is very true of any technology. Having worked in the technology space to a certain extent, I can say that for sure that every technology has a maturity cycle to it, and who is going to get that technology at the beginning of its maturity cycle depends a lot on what you mentioned, Prabin, in terms of how we are designing the incentives and who is funding them. Essentially, these two questions are very critical to that dialogue, And if you trace the global capital flow of any technology, it is primarily driven from developed countries. So essentially what happens is that technology transfer or some sort of technical assistance to developing countries help you drive those costs down in these economies, and then which leads to a certain level of mass adoption. And we will see that to an extent in the same story for frontier technologies in terms of managing our aquatic ecosystems as well. But and which is why, like, I will go back to the point I started with in the opening statement, is that we need to constantly question who owns this data that we are collecting through these technologies. Because if these are commercial applications that are going to be deployed in pockets around the world, there is going to be an ethical question around it, because these are global commons, and then that data can be leveraged for any X purposes. It can be sold by tech companies, it can be in fact added as a layer on to sort of aggravate the issues that we are seeing today in terms of overfishing, in terms of illegal trading, and all of that, right? So essentially, I think we should be very mindful of when we say deployment of frontier technologies for managing our aquatic ecosystems, because that is definitely one of the key questions for me. And uh, uh, I mean, like, one of the other things, and this is like the solutioning part of it, Prabin, that you mentioned, that if we had to do this as a global community, how can we do that? Because eventually your capital will move in that same shape and format, considering there is a technological advantage in some economies and not every nation has that advantage, right? So essentially, what nation states can probably then play a role is in terms of sort of mapping which technologies are critical to conservation efforts in their own geographies, and then there will be certain technologies that will sort of emerge as very critical to some of these solutionings that nation states sort of design in their own action plans and in terms of their own conservation efforts. And and then the governments can definitely start with sort of providing SOPs to people who are helping drive down the cost in terms of mass adoption. But I think in this piece, the most critical thing that's going to be in terms of what value are these technologies creating for local communities, as KP mentioned. Because if you can unlock that value creation and the potential of that technology at the local level, then you don't need to subsidize those technologies for mass adoption, right? It essentially unlocks the value that if you provide that capacity building through your innovation missions or through your state capacity building programs, then what you essentially do is you deploy that technology as a pilot to increase either the livelihoods of people, or sort of provide a secure way of secure and sustainable way of, say, uh, uh, you know uh, e- uh, making use of some of those resources that we are talking about. And then that value that technology deployment creates for those local communities sort of then becomes the critical mass that will help it sustain its own journey. So essentially, and this is something that we are seeing in, like, even in India to an extent, that there are coastal communities who are leveraging some of these technology solutions in terms of weather forecast and when to venture out in the sea, when to not. And although initially these were technologies that were sort of subsidized by the government, today you don't see that happening. It sort of sustains its own momentum once communities see that value unlocking at the at the base of the pyramid. So I think we need to create those solutions and think about what that technology can help unlock for these local communities, which is, I think, the biggest question for any nation state to answer today.
Thank you, Swasti, for that. And I think we were supposed to give 20 minutes for questions, but the panel seems to have gone a little over time. But the chat box is open for questions now. If anyone would like to put a question in, it would be great. We could open it for the rest of the panel. And till those questions flow in, if any of the panelists want to put in a concluding remark, I think right now would be the perfect time. Since we're all policymakers here, I think we all do understand that the endeavor of adding aquatic ecology and the frontier technology is one which is difficult, which Swasti and KP have very well mapped out. So I think through this panel, one of the biggest takeaways would be that there needs to be community engagement, and there needs to be an a method through which the community understands the need and finds itself wanting to introduce frontier technology rather than it being a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach in which the community itself is involved in understanding how the technology will impact the ecology and is not just following directions from a state would be more effective, as once there is incentive and once there is a deeper understanding on what the actions are and why these actions are being taken, there is more of an innate human drive for the actions and for these communities to act in accordance to what is required. So I think with that in mind, if anyone would like to add any concluding remarks, that the floor is open, and if anyone would like to post a question, you could put it up on the chat box and we'll pose it to the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Praveen. I think you've actually highlighted couple of things. But one thing I would like to add on to it is that in most developing countries, there's been an issue concerning centralization of power. When it comes to conservation, this has to be delegated. There has to be administrative catchments that are actually empowered with the right technology in compliance or in agreement with the local community to be able to manage the water resources. This is very imperative in deploying relevant frontier technology and establishing citizen observatory, like I mentioned earlier. And in so doing, we'll be able to address the issue that has to do with human rights approach to water, economic approach to water, address issue that has to do with social equity or different dimension of equity that exists in community. Because you can expect the Minister of Water Resources to be down in every community at the same time. So if we have delegated approach to which enhanced technology towards managing our catchment, I think that would be the best way to be able to solve issue that has to do with every element approach towards water and also improve livelihood as well. And also concerning data, I think ownership should be delegated to the country because the country best determine their own interests based on their sovereignty rights. I think this approach should be addressed by the United Nations, despite the fact that this is kind of inherent approach based on the sovereignty nature of every country, but the United Nations needs to help to support every country to have access to their own data and to also restrict the privacy nature of the data rather than capitalist approach towards data sharing and data usage. Thank you.
Thank you, Said, for that. And I think that's a really important point, is that a knowledge repository which would be accessible to many developed states would not be accessible to developing states in Asia and Africa. And that bridge of knowledge is one which is very pivotal to be solved, because of the fact that while technology exists, it may not reach the right or the needed audience. And again, talking about delegation, that's a very important point. Whereas we know that a lot of developing states do not like to give away power, I think in the state we are, and I think the need of the time is that there is effective delegation, because of the fact that, as you mentioned, there is one water resource minister who cannot be everywhere and who may not be aware of all the issues. And I think delegation is the only effective is the solution to that. But I think that delegation also comes with proper and well-structured methods of checks and balances which need to exist in regards to that the technology is actually being implemented. Because historically we have seen in states, giving the example of India, where when the funding is provided, the funding has been misused. So I think when we do talk about delegation, we also need to add the fact of checks and balances which are present, because uh, these are large funds and these are large projects which require collective effort, and even with delegation there might be a lack of accountability which needs, and thus checks and balances would solve that lack of accountability which exists. And yeah, I think that was a great point. And if there are any other panelists who would like to add on and build on what to say you talked about, or introduce any other point which we would like to wrap up soon on.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one last point. So we also have to understand that policy making about aquatic ecology, in a sort of a siloed way is also not sustainable. We also have to understand the interactions between land and water, between terrestrial use of land and how that impacts our aquatic ecosystems, and how water use impacts, and how agricultural water use impacts the health of an aquatic ecosystem. So I think that is also something that we have to consider, because when we're making a policy, it's not solely about that policy itself, but also how it, again, the interconnectedness point, right? Which is something that as policymakers, we have to be informed. Again, I have a quick anecdote here. So in the aftermath of the cyclone Amphan, not Amphan, sorry, the older one, the 2009. Ila, I think it was called, I forgot the name. But yeah, so there was a village again in the Sundarbans area, which was extremely ravaged by the cyclone, right? But then through technological interventions with respect to climate resilient agriculture and educating the local communities in making sure that the way that they sort of cultivate their plants and they cultivate their crops does not adversely impact the health of the ecosystem. And that has really created very significant increase in their agricultural yield, and sort of also has empowered the local communities, and now they have a more sustainable livelihood, and they are, closer in terms of how they interact with the nature around them. And that is also something that we should consider, I think. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. And I think we're about to reach the end. If there are any questions, I would which need to be directed to any of the panelists, again, the chat box is open, and I would urge everyone to join it in the conversation, because aquatic ecology, as Swasti mentioned, water is 70% of the earth, and if there is not effective solutions found, we do exist in a state where it could be detrimental for the future. So I think this panel is covering a lot of very important stuff, because of the fact that while frontier, as has been talked about by everyone, while frontier technology does exist, frontier technology is not available, and frontier technology is not accessible to the people who need it, and the communities which need to implement it are not aware. And I think as policymakers, one thing which definitely does strike out is that the policies are not on implementation of the frontier technology as much as it's about making people aware, and making the communities actually understand the need and how it could be added on, and how could they actually be effective in using frontier technology. And they could basically coming back to the point that it is the community, and it is individuals which are unaware of frontier technology, which you usually need to apply it the most. So for a state, the biggest role is not of just funding and just researching about the frontier technology. It is either actually taking the knowledge which is created and implementing it successfully, implementing it efficiently, so that the right people and the right communities are getting the required technology and are implementing it. And I think we have a question which talks about the funding of the technology. I would open up the panel if anyone wants to talk about how this funding should take place, and if there is a right method or a wrong method of how historically this funding has taken place. Because if we talk about aquatic ecology funding, that is something which is still new, and while certain governments are investing heavily into it, we also need to keep in mind certain governments cannot invest heavily into it. Therefore, I think if the panel could take that forward and talk about how there needs to be this, how funding needs to be turned into more efficient, and how we could have international funding. So I think if anyone of the panels would want to talk about it.
I can probably take a shot at that,
Sure.
Praveen. So this is one aspect I did touch upon in my opening remark, that I think one of the biggest challenges of deployment of any sort of frontier technology anywhere in the world is we need to be very mindful of who's funding it. Because essentially, and if you look at some of these studies that are being done across the world, there are certain contracts in place that, those studies are supposed to feed in a particular sort of, an agenda, maybe. Agenda being a negative word here, but I mean, like, sometimes it could be also big for a broader initiative at the global level. But I think effectively, like, for example, if you look at some of those studies in terms of creating the 3D maps of the Caribbean seabed, uh, these are studies being conducted by NOAA for specific purposes. The data that they're collecting is massive, in terms of uh, around which season of the year what kind of fish species is spawning where in a particular location. And that's very critical, that's a critical data set in terms of our understanding of aquatic ecology and what are those interlinkages and interdependence within that food chain. Because I mean, till we don't understand that, like for example, what kind of seabed flow supports what kind of fishes, and then that sort of supports what kind of a coral reef ecosystem, till we don't understand that, I don't think we will be able to go forward in terms of evolving our understanding of how to preserve them either. But essentially those data sets in terms of which species are spawning where at what time of the year can also be misused by governments, for example, to then direct trawlers in that particular area for fishing in a particular season. So I think it's a double-edged sword, and that's true for any technology, for any application. But I think, which is why what you raised as a point in terms of funding is one of the most critical pieces when we are saying let's deploy technology for preservation, right? Who is using that data and where is it being funded for are very critical questions. It There could be studies that are actually being funded by labels that are being used to ensure that a product is sustainably fished, but we don't know. So I mean, these are patterns that are emerging across the world, but there needs to be a lot more research in terms of how those global capital is actually moving and funding some of these researches. Which is why, like, I think whenever we look at some of these data sets, we should always be mindful of who's funding that study and what is the objective of that particular study. And just to give you an example, for example, NOAA, which is owns a lot of data sets in terms of some of these bathymetric studies or topography studies of the seabed, are actually collaborating with Amazon, and Amazon has recently launched an initiative which is called Amazon Data Sustainability Initiative, in which they have gone ahead and made all these data sets public, and they are inviting all sorts of researchers, innovators to come and use these data sets and sort of innovate and develop products and solutions around it, which is, I think, one of the initiatives that is sort of pushing for more transparency and use of these data sets for global applications. But it's just one of the instances. Most often researchers don't have access to those data sets and they have to go and procure them. So then they are sitting in silos with ownership issues around who owns that data. So I think, and whether it can actually be made public for everyone. So I think there's a whole privacy, compliance, and risk element involved in that question, and which is why funding becomes like one of the most critical links for me as we go forward in terms of deploying these technologies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank
Sahid,
you.
you can go
Sahid
for
could
it.
take over from now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's actually a very brilliant question. Who funds the technology? And I would like to say it from different angles. One, who funds the technology and who owns the technology? Because a company can actually design a technology and still owns that technology, whereas the beneficiaries can just use half of the technology, what the technology can do in terms of, I'm coming from the perspective of analytics. Let's talk, for instance, for Facebook. Facebook does have this analytics that can examine who comes on board, what's your current status, what have you been doing with Facebook for the last 2 or 5 minutes, or how many times you come to Facebook. And using these analytics as in terms of, they could sell it out for commercial purposes, they can use it to track your position. So for me, the funding actually determines the ownership. And who funds this? If a foreign government is actually funding the technology, they literally own the technology. So what I, in my own kind of instant and speed experience, I feel that if any developing country is buying a technology and is getting funding for a foreign land, I think there's a need for an ethical situation for them to own that technology and with the analytics of that technology, and avoid the company that created the technology. Because I've seen a case where a particular technology was used to actually survey, there was a particular research that was conducted in Africa, I think maybe around vaccine or so, and it was used to collect a lot of data. But the data that was collected was not actually the data they are interested in. It was just like, okay, we wanted to check the health status of people in this particular region. Whereas they were trying to test the effectiveness of a particular vaccine that was given to the people in the community. This was solely because the people that funded it were from some European countries. So I would see the funding from the ethical perspective of data analytics to say, if you're a developing country, you're trying to use a particular technology, if the funding comes from a developed country, try as much as possible to ensure that you take ownership and the data analytics and the privacy of that particular technology. That's my reservation.
Thank you for that. I think that covered most of the points regarding that question really well. We do have another question in the chat, which is more geared towards India and how research is essential in policy making in India, which I think has already kind of been touched upon in the panel, that research is critical to actually establish these policies and actually find effective solutions to the policy. But and how do you, and why do you, and the second question is, why is research being undermined in India, which is uh, and another interesting question, because at the state we are in India, production is given, and rather than research, production is given precedence. So if one of the panelists would like to take over and try and answer that question, that would be great.
I think all the panelists would be having something or the other to say on this, considering they are the GPODS fellows. So I think, I mean, please, Neha, you can go ahead with this.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's undermined because that adds a lot of negative connotation to it, but I would say that it is not encouraged a lot. That has a lot to do with the overall education situation that we have in our country. But let me go over the entire second question that Rajita has asked. So, okay, what I would say is research. When we say research, it's let's consider PhD plus research, PhD and ahead, any research that goes into it. So there are indeed subsidies, but then we do need more people to take a PhD, and then we need more grants to those people to carry out their research. We need that level of infrastructure, that level of technology, so that they are able to monitor, they are able to survey, do all the surveillance that they require for their research, etc. So I would say that as a nation we are developing. There it is catching attention, but there needs to be more grants, and we need overall awareness amongst our scientific society in India to encourage more students to take up research.
And just as a plug to what Neha said, as someone who belongs to a family of scientists in India working in this very space, I just want to add on that, one of the main reasons, and I would probably take up the second part of it, because I don't necessarily think that there's lack of research. There is enough work being done on the ground, and scientists in India are actually one of the it's actually one of the few places where, despite a lot of encouragement, if that's a word, but despite like a lot of disincentives, scientists do typically tend to work with local communities, which is a very unique model, that in that sense. But I think what we lack probably in the country is an entire ecosystem of how academics can also play a major role in creating some of these solutions. And although we see these pockets of interventions where scientists are working with and that's true for even agriculture, not just aquatic ecology, they're working with coastal farmers in terms of how to increase their productivity. The debate till date is also around productivity rather than conservation, and because we are a developing nation, our imperatives are very different. It's more about preserving their livelihood and also helping them sustain their own just like it's hand to mouth living literally in coastal areas. So how do you then encourage them to get a better catch, and how can we do that sustainably is still not a very big priority for the government, which is why why it's not being funded either, as Neha mentioned, you know. And although we have these great institutions like IITs and a lot of engineering colleges that are offering degree programs in disciplines such as niche as these, uh, we don't see the government then becoming a sort of enabler to set up and lay the groundwork of that ecosystem where, you know, scientists work with local communities for policy implementation, and our engineering colleges then become like this sort of thought leaders or creators of those technologies that can help drive those costs down and also increase the adoption of it. So I think somewhere we are failing in terms of creating that what we were talking about, like a circular model for exchange of knowledge and laying down that ecosystem in place. So uh, it's, and I completely agree that it's a problem, because I think if what we are talking about is about delegation and localization of these solutions, it's again like one of the most important missing links in India.
And just to add to Swasti's point, I think a lot of times policy implementation and policies actually turning into actionable legislations depends quite a bit on the political will, right? And like Swasti has mentioned, the fact that our priorities as a developing country are quite different. So so the role of political will is something that I wanted to just bring to your attention here as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are in fact telling our research institutions in India to raise their own funds, which is absurd in my mind. I mean, if in a developing country your government is not going to fund research, who else will? There's nobody else. You can't raise money on your own. Because you're still in an you have a technological disadvantage, and then if you're supposed to do pilots and commercialize them at the same time as a research institute, you will fail somewhere, right? So I think that's one of the bigger problems in terms, and it's a capital problem, it's a funding problem, essentially.
Yeah, definitely not a talent problem, because we have a lot of Indians working across the globe on different levels to, enable the overall survival of mankind. But yeah, definitely it's a capital problem.
Yeah, I would like to chip in one thing concerning the question. I'm not from India, but I had colleagues who have actually worked in India. And I would say, because I also like follow up with some projects across the world. There was one specific project that was conducted by GIZ in 2015. Up to date, India still have a lot of areas that still suffer from sewage problems. Sewage management problem is a very, very tough problem in India. And India is used to a centralized wastewater management system. But GIZ went on board and they conducted a serious and a thorough research that gave back a decentralized way of managing wastewater. And this actually proved to be, in fact, they went ahead to also help the policy of decentralized waste management in India as of now. And they helped so many community in Delhi, and also I saw some of the templates. So I think research is actually very much paramount. Most countries still rely on centralized wastewater management system, and this is really outdated. So research have shown, most especially the GI, in fact, in GIZ, when GIZ conducted the research and they were able to put a lot of decentralized wastewater management system in place, and it worked. It's been explored to other countries. In fact, I know it was in Uganda that I learned of those mission then, and it was really, really very great. So research in policy making, I think it has helped India to a large extent. And most recently too, there was a consortium of organizations that involved the London School of Hygiene. They helped some schools in developing a kind of decentralized system as well, because most of the sewage system in India, in Delhi and some other places, are complicated and not easy to manage by the community. So they develop a kind of a friendly way of managing wastewater systems using local technology that's a lot of people have actually developed. So I think there's a lot of things going on in India, and a lot of researchers actually have proved very much accurate using local knowledge. In fact, people from the school that was televised, I watched the clip, was not last week, I watched the clip from a friend who sent it to me about the mission of the London School of Hygiene, another such consortium, some schools in India, using simple technology to ensure accurate wastewater management. So I think thorough researches that was done by this school, combined with the technical expertise from the London School of Hygiene, have actually proved to be very much profitable. And I think research is actually very much important. It has helped India. But one thing about it is the politics disenfranchisement. I think if the political class can actually support some of these missions, it could actually help them in formulating good policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think on that, we have covered a lot about how frontier technology, what is the future of frontier technology in aquatic ecosystems. It is not only, it is no longer about finding the right technology, but it is finding out how to implement the right technology in the right problems and how to actually get community engagement and actually find a way for these frontier technology to reach the point where it is actually effective. And I think that all our panelists, and I thank all our panelists for providing such great insights on the same. And I see we've already ran out of time and we're 15 minutes over. So I think right now would be a good time for us to wrap up. And I would thank everyone for coming and spending time and giving your time to us to talk about such an important issue. And I think there'll be a lot of takeaways from this panel. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you for joining, and see everyone soon. And yeah.
Can we please give a few minutes to Sir Ernie Garrett?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Nick, could you unmute yourself? We can't hear you. And I hope I pronounced your name right.
Please guide Ernie. I guess
It
I
should
think
be on the
you-
left-hand bottom side of your screen.
Yeah,
There
you
would
just
be
need to unmute
you just
yourself.
need to click on that.
please guide him. Can we please guide in the
Can the host unmute him by any chance? Just try, Praveen.
Yeah, let me try and do that.
text? We can text.
So, Arnie, I think there's a pop-up. I have asked you to unmute.
Yeah, I think there should be a pop-up because I have also asked you to unmute. If you could just press unmute.
There's a pop-up on your screen.
We can ask Sir to comment if he cannot unmute. I think he must be having some problem accessing the screen and all.
Yeah, yeah. If you want, Ernie, you could just type out what you were saying because I think there seems to be some issue and you're not able to unmute. So if you could type out your thoughts, that would be great. I think it would be a great help for everyone attending this panel to gauge information and learn something.
Yeah, Sir, please type your yeah, very good.
There I am. Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. What I want to say is that I have been listening to your conversation about the subject here, and I can tell you that in Norway, all this is organized by the government, down to the individual who are taking part in this. So I would recommend you to take contact with the Norwegian government, and then you will find out.
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of the Scandinavian countries and especially Norway itself have become pioneers of how to actually how to implement this frontier technology successfully. And there are a lot of takeaways which all the states could take from that. And I think it would be the best method would be to replicate the Norwegian model and find successes for that model and find some tweaks to that model to find its scalability through to larger states like India. And yes, that I think that was a great and very important point as Norway becomes a leader in aquatic technology and aquatic and frontier technology for aquatic ecology, and it is an inspiration for other states to take into account.
Because we have a very high level of technology in the this subject here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you. And yeah, again, that was a very important point which had to be raised. And again, thank you everyone for attending this panel and giving us your time to talk about such an important issue. And I hope you guys are safe, and I hope everyone is safe from COVID and everyone makes it through
Yeah.
this pandemic. And